Today, your National Association for Gun Rights is calling for Attorney General Pam Bondi to be fired. That's a tall order, and that may catch some of you off guard, but allow me to make the case plainly. Like many, we had severe reservations about the nomination of Pam Bondi. She didn't have a record of anything so extreme as supporting assault weapons bans, but she did have a tendency that I view a bit more pernicious. You know the phrase, death by 1,000 cuts? Well, Pam Bondi has held that knife more than a few times in her political career, and it's always the cuts from a supposed friend that hurt the most. When a Democrat stumps for full-blown confiscation, you and I at least know where they stand and what the threat level is if they were to take power. What is often more dangerous is when you deal with Republicans, particularly the kind who care more about image and polls than you do about restoring God-given rights. Make no mistake, I'm not saying Bondi is cut from the same cloth as Feinstein or Schumer. She's clearly better than whomever would have been in her place had Kamala Harris been elected. But is that the only standard by which we should judge? If that's the case, we should just pack this whole thing up because the bar is so low that we would never be able to mount a grievance. But gun owners didn't show up at the polls to get some slightly better than complete destruction of their fundamental rights. We were promised not simply a casual defense that the Republican Party has begrudgingly granted us over the years. We demanded and were promised real, tangible reforms and a reversal of decades of abuse. Some in our circle have been disappointed with Bondi over what they perceive as a lack of positive action. They're saying that the goal is unguarded and she won't make a strike. But it's much worse than overpromising or under-delivering. She's actively been playing goalie for the other side, going to great lengths behind the scenes to protect state power at the expense of your Second Amendment rights. And that is far more egregious than disappointing. That is active sabotage. I refuse to believe this is the best we can get. This year was, and still is, the greatest opportunity for gun owners in my lifetime. And that opportunity is being woefully squandered in real time right before our eyes. If you don't believe me or you think that I'm being unfair, let me walk through her record before her nomination, what she has done since, and then you be the judge. But be prepared, this is a very long list. The straw that broke the camel's back came this week when she convinced a federal judge to demand the member lists of two national Second Amendment advocacy organizations. But more on that in a moment. Let's start with her record as Florida's Attorney General so we can kind of establish a pattern. Exhibit A, Bondi opposed paying gun owners for their seized bump stocks. In 2019, Bondi succeeded in getting Florida courts to dismiss a case that would have called the seizures unconstitutional and would have compensated the affected parties. Exhibit B, in 2018, Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi's office helped draft Florida's red flag gun confiscation law. She described how law enforcement could seize firearms without due process. Now, this law has stripped thousands of Floridians of their gun rights, including children as young as 8 years old. Bondi referred to the law as, quotes, the right thing to do. And she said, quotes,
let law enforcement come in and take the guns.
Sounds like she and John Cornyn would get along just fine. Exhibit C. Bondi sided with the state, upholding a ban on military-aged adults from purchasing a rifle, a position she seemingly still holds to this day. Exhibit D. Bondi was instrumental in shutting down the move for free open carry in Florida in the case State versus Norman. Despite a judge raising constitutional concerns, Bondi's team worked to block the case from being reviewed by an appellate court. At the time, the defense for Bondi was that she was just following orders on behalf of then Florida Governor Rick Scott, and that under this administration, she would be free to be a pro-gun champion. So let's discuss how that has worked out. Exhibit E. Pam Bondi's Department of Justice still upholds Biden's engaged in the business ATF gun control rule. Rather than repealing the Biden-era engaged in the business ATF rule, that gave the ATF a blank check to crack down on private firearm sales, Bondi's DOJ has reviewed the rule for months while still enforcing it against gun owners. Reminder, this is the same rule that killed Brian Malinowski. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice repeatedly asked the courts to delay the legal challenges that could bring relief for gun owners. Exhibit F, Bondi's DOJ is advocating for lifetime gun bans for nonviolent offenses. Bondi's DOJ asked the Supreme Court not to restore the rights of nonviolent felons in Vincent versus Bondi. Instead, advocated for federal law to continue stripping gun rights from nonviolent offenders for life. Now, Exhibit G, Bondi's DOJ has repeatedly supported banning guns from military-aged adults. Bondi's DOJ is actively attempting to undermine the Fifth Circuit's pro-gun ruling in McCoy versus ATF, which held that the federal ban on handgun sales to 18 to 20-year-olds is unconstitutional. Meanwhile, her DOJ asked the Supreme Court not to overturn the Fourth Circuit's ruling upholding that very same gun control law. These actions support stripping gun rights from American adults who are old enough to fight and die for our country. Exhibit H. Here is the one that is absolute day one no-brainer. Stop the Department of Justice from continuing to prosecute anti-gun cases that were initiated under the previous Biden administration. Cases like Matt Hoover, Patrick Adamiak, in which regular gun owners were swept under an aggressive Biden ATF under the most trumped-up charges imaginable. These are just two examples of political attacks against the gun community, and yet these two are still in prison and Bondi is still punching the gas. Disgraceful. Exhibit I. You may recall at the beginning of the year that Bondi was ordered to conduct a survey of all the Second Amendment infringements employed under the previous federal administration and report back with a plan to disassemble them in 30 days after the order. That was 8 months ago. As we can see, very little has been cut and even more has been championed by Bondi's DOJ. Exhibit J. In April of this year, Bondi went back to her roots. After the Cargill decision was handed down by the court, effectively overturning the bump stock ban, Bondi still argued that the state should not have to pay restitution to gun owners who had their property stolen. Exhibit K. A lot of alarm bells have been ringing that the ATF has been quietly building an immense 1 billion plus list of gun owners, aka a registry. In fact, I did a video on that just last week. There has not been so much as a peep from her or her DOJ on holding the ATF accountable to that law. Now, Exhibit L. Right as we sat down to write this on Friday, the 10th of October, we got wind that Bondi's DOJ is arguing to the Supreme Court that the National Firearms Act's taxation and registration requirements for short-barreled rifles do not violate the Second Amendment, stating that short-barreled rifles, which are legal in several other countries, are far too dangerous for the United States because they are especially susceptible to criminal misuse. That is a mind-numbing statement. And now we get to what really kicked all of this off. Directly attacking national gun rights organizations by demanding their private membership lists. That's right, Pam Bondi's DOJ successfully scored a court order for two gun groups to hand over their members' private information to the federal government. What could go wrong? It's almost certain to include names, addresses, contact info, I think literally everything. In that very same lawsuit challenging handgun purchase rights for 18 to 20-year-olds, which is the McCoy versus ATF, Bondi's DOJ argued that a two-tiered classification of gun owners, those who belong to the plaintiff gun rights organizations and those who don't. Then Bondi's DOJ argued that they had to know who the members of those gun rights organizations were so the DOJ could be sure to protect their rights and only their rights. Now, this is a clear violation of the First Amendment right to freely associate and to do so anonymously. But Bondi's DOJ thinks gun owners should have to choose between their First Amendment rights and their Second Amendment rights. And they told the court just that. Here is actually what they wrote verbatim. To be sure, the organizational members may have a First Amendment right to decline to disclose the identity of the members to defendants. But the organizational plaintiffs cannot have it both ways. The organizational plaintiffs cannot simultaneously decline to identify any of their members and at the same time insist that the court award permanent relief to unidentified persons whose membership has not been verified. Why is Bondi's DOJ playing hardball? If we're to believe her rhetoric that gun owners aren't second-class citizens, then why are they hurting instead of helping? These are the exact same tactics used by the DOJ under Joe Biden, and that is inexcusable. To be fair, Bondi's DOJ has done some good things for the Second Amendment, But those things are increasingly dwarfed by the ongoing and active harms this DOJ continues to perpetrate against gun rights. The absolute baseline for any pro-gun attorney general should be to first do no harm to gun rights. And in Pam Bondi's case, not only has her DOJ continued Biden-era gun controls, but is actively working behind the scenes against gun rights. With numerous anti-gun actions under Pam Bondi's belt, it's clear that any advances for the Second Amendment are being made at a snail's pace, if at all. And that's why now is the time to bring the hammer down on Pam Bondi for her relentless actions that betray the people she swore to protect. That's why I'm asking everyone to go in the comments below and in the description and click that link and sign the petition calling on Pam Bondi to be fired. We only have 3 more years of a pro-gun administration before we face the possibility of, God forbid, a Gavin Newsom presidency. We may never have a better opportunity to reclaim our gun rights. We cannot squander the remaining time we have left. It's time for gun owners to demand full-throated, unequivocal support for the Second Amendment from the Attorney General and DOJ. And I'm convinced Pam Bondi cannot give us that. Thank you for watching.